engage in the attack. Or those two people, if the terrorist doesn't want to wait, those two people would be the first people that they would kill. Because if they killed those, then they would know that there other people on the bus wouldn't be able to go and resist the attack. And so Israel just kept on spending more and more money on trying to kind of flood the area with cops, but they eventually realized that there was no way that they were going to be able to cover all potential vulnerable targets. Because if the terrorists were just patient and waited long enough, they would find some places, some bus, some mall, some place where there weren't police officers there for a few minutes, where they would be able to go and engage in their attack. And so what they did was, in '72, they changed the rules and allowed Israeli citizens to go and carry concealed handguns. Right now, about 15% of the adult Jewish population in Israel is allowed to carry concealed handguns. And whenever there's an increase in terrorist attacks, the national police chief in Israel will go on the media and basically urge those who are able to carry concealed handguns to make sure that they do so all the time when they're traveling around, because they never know when they're going to be able to use them. Now, there is an interesting thing that happened, and that is, if you look at terrorist attacks over time in Israel, what you'll find is that all the time up until '72, virtually all the terrorist attacks involved machine guns. After 1972, virtually all of them involved bombs. There was no technological change that occurred right then in terms of being able to build bombs. But what happened is that machine guns appeared to be their preferred method of attack, because they had a choice to use both beforehand. But what changed is that when you pull out a machine gun, you give the option for those around you to respond to your attack. There was one newspaper story that made a big impact on me about a terrorist attack shortly after the change in the law in '72, where 4 armed terrorists attacked a mall in Tel Aviv. They pulled out their machine guns, started firing, and people in the crowd around them pulled out their handguns and started firing back at the terrorists. 3 of the terrorists were killed. 1 was severely injured, and when he was being taken to the hospital in an ambulance, the attendants in the ambulance reported to the newspaper that the terrorist was very upset. He was just inconsolable. That no one had told him that the old ladies in the mall there would be having handguns with them. These older ladies, because it was just in the afternoon, it was during work hours, they were the ones doing the shopping, were the ones who had pulled out their handguns and started firing. Does anybody know where the 2 worst high school shootings in the world were? Yeah.
There was one in England, wasn't there?
Well, there was elementary school shooting in England, but they were in Germany. In the last decade, the 2 worst public school shootings have been in Germany. One involved 18, another one 17 fatalities. But there are a lot of attacks that occur in Europe. You've had, I think it was 10 that were killed about a year ago in Finland in a school. You go through these, you find multiple victim public shootings in France. You find, even in Switzerland, this last decade you had one case where 14 people were killed in a parliamentary building in the canton of Zug. But there's one common feature that these places have, that they were all gun-free zones. And what you find is that if you actually look at the rate per capita of multiple victim public shootings in Europe for involving more than 4 people killed, Europe's per capita rate is very similar to what it is in the United States. Even despite the fact that they have very strict gun laws in places like Germany or France or other places where you have to go through long licensing and psychological screening tests, rules that go well beyond what's been advocated for anybody here, at least in the main debate, on the issue of gun control. I think part of what goes on, because like I get calls from media around the world when there are attacks in the United States, and they often will ask me things like, well, you know, why the United States have so many of these attacks, and when I get calls from countries like Germany or whatever, I'll just remind them of the history of these attacks that they've had in this last decade, and they usually have forgotten about them until they're mentioned to them. But now, you know, we have laws around the country. We have only 2 states in the United States that still ban people being able to carry concealed handguns, Illinois and Wisconsin. And there's a good chance that at least one and possibly both of those states will change their laws after this election. And we have 40 states with right to carry laws like Texas does, 8 states which have more restrictive may issue. Right to carry laws mean once you meet certain objective criteria, you're a certain age, you apply for a permit, you pass a criminal background check, you meet the training requirements if there are any, and the permit's automatically granted. The 8 may states may have those rules, but then in addition, they may also require that you get permission from some local public official by demonstrating that you have a certain need to go and carry the permit concealed handgun. Now, just as an aside, Texas actually has a relatively restrictive right to carry law. You have about, or as I mentioned before, over 410,000 people right now in the state with concealed carry permits. Compared to something like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has less than half the population that Texas has, but they have, I guess, about 720,000 people right now with concealed carry permits. Why do they have not quite twice as many with half the population? And the reason is very simple. It has to do with the differences in the laws. Texas, to get a concealed handgun permit, if you're under 65, you got to pay $140. You have to undergo 10 hours of training. You have to go 10 hours of training to renew your permit. In Pennsylvania, it's about a $20 fee to go and get your permit, and there's no training requirement. Plus, Texas has still a relatively long list, including campuses, where you're not allowed to go and carry a permanent concealed handgun. Pennsylvania has no such list. The only places that are excluded are places which are banned under federal law. And you know, you see these rules have a big impact. You charge more, fewer people get permits, but it also changes the mix of people who get permits. My research on concealed carry indicates to me that the people who benefit the most from concealed carry are basically poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. And when you go and you raise a fee, not only do you have fewer people getting permits, but you also see a mix in the type of people who get permits. You basically squeeze out particularly those people who benefit the most from having a permit. And you know, this is the type of issue that I think is going to come up more with like the DC and Chicago new gun laws with the huge fees that they have for people being able to go and get permits, because the Washington Post did a study a little while ago which claimed that it took about $500 for them to go through the process to register a handgun. And so that basically means to me it's basically only going to be fairly wealthy individuals who are going to be able to go and get the permits, not the people who would benefit the most from having a gun to be able to go and protect themselves. Now, one of the reasons why I think people have the perceptions that they do about concealed carry and kind of concerns about campuses is due to media coverage. Most people get their information about guns from the news media. And when was the last time you listened to the national evening news broadcast and heard a story about somebody using a gun to protect themselves or protect somebody else? My guess is it's probably pretty hard for you to recall such a story. But probably without trying at all, you can recall what seem to be hundreds or even thousands of stories of bad things that have happened with guns. You know, the FBI has something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, where they survey about 100 to 150,000 people each year to try to get information on the number of crimes that occurred. Because we could just go and look at gun crimes reported to police. In any given year, there are about 200,000 to 250,000 gun crimes reported to police. The problem is, a lot of crimes are never reported to police. So, for example, rape. Only about half of rapes are reported to police. Well, how do we know that only half, or think that only half of rapes are reported to police? We have these large surveys that can go and estimate how many rapes occurred and then compare it to how many are reported. Well, we do the same thing with guns, and so rather than the reported 200 to 250,000, we find that the surveys indicate that there are about 400 to 450,000 gun crimes a year. Twice as much as what were reported. Good reason to go and do the survey. But those same types of surveys indicate that Americans use guns defensively about 2 million times a year. So that means Americans use guns defensively about 4 to 5 times more frequently to stop crimes than they use them to commit crimes. But my guess is if we were going to go ask most people about that, they think the ratio goes in the opposite direction and maybe even more lopsided in the other direction. And that's because they get their notions of the costs and benefits of guns from listening to the media. And if they only hear about bad things that happen and never hear about the benefits, it's not too surprising that they come to those conclusions. Now, one thing I can say in the defense of media, it's a key fact. About 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, they merely have to brandish it for the criminal to break off an attack. Rarely is the criminal killed. Fewer than 1 out of every 1,000 times that people use guns defensively. So let's say you're editor of a news bureau, and you have 2 stories that come across your desk. One where there's a dead body on the ground, sympathetic person like a victim. And another case where, let's say, a woman's brandished a gun, the criminals run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, no crime actually committed. You're not even sure what crime might have been committed if it hadn't been stopped. Which story is more newsworthy? I think anybody in this room would honestly have to say that the first story is much more newsworthy than the second. We may care about both stories from a policy perspective, but in terms of what the media should cover, it explains, I think, a lot about why they cover the things that they cover there. I don't think that explains all of it, though, because when you talk about these types of multiple victim public shootings, there's a particular type of bias that exists. My guess is, for example, that relatively few people know that over 25% of the multiple victim public school shootings have been stopped by citizens well before uniformed police were able to arrive. And the reason why they're unlikely to know that is that when those cases occur, only about 1% of the news stories on those incidents will mention that fact. If you look at when police stop a multiple victim public shooting, about 34% of the news stories will mention how those attacks ended. So for example, if you look at the first of the public school shootings in October 1997 at Pearl, Mississippi High School, if you go and do a nexus search, this was originally was supposed to be sponsored by the Federal Society, which would have been all lawyers in law school. So they would know this, but there's something called Nexus or Westlaw. If you use a Nexus search, what you can find in the 1 month after that attack, you'd see 687 separate news stories about the incident. Of those 600, basically what had happened was there was a assistant principal there at the school, a former Marine, had a permit to carry a concealed handgun, apparently regularly up until the end of 1995 when the Safe School Zone Act was passed, he regularly kept his handgun with him on school property. After the ban was passed, he would park his car more than 1,000 feet off of school property in order to obey the law. And when the attack started that day, he literally had to run a half mile to get his gun and a half mile back. But he still was able to hold the attacker at point blank range on the ground for over 5.5 minutes before the police arrived. The attacker was in the process of leaving the high school to go across the street to the middle school where he was going to continue his attack. Now, there are 687 separate news stories. 19 of them will mention the assistant principal in any way. 13 of the 19 mention that the assistant principal had something to do with stopping the attack. And 10 of the 13 mentioned that he used his gun to stop the attack. 8 of those news stories were in local media near where the attack had occurred, but 2 of them were on national news. One was on ABC World News Now at 4 a.m. This is kind of the over-the-night ABC News broadcast. And the other one was on a show they used to have on CNN Early Prime, that played about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But those were the only 10 mentions. And I can go through attack after attack, and you regularly will see about only 1% of those news stories will mention that that's the case. And I think it has a big impact on people's perceptions. I talk to people in the media, I do work for people in the media, and I've tried to get them to go and mention things like, did these attacks, these multiple victim public shootings attacks, occur in gun-free zones? Because essentially what you find is that all the multiple victim public shootings involving 4 or more victims always occur when they're in public in gun-free zones. And I think it would make some difference in the debate after a while if even once in a while the media would say, and another one of these attacks, just like the one today, fortunately nobody was killed, occurred in a place where permanent concealed handguns are not allowed. But I think these things have a big impact. Now, one of the questions is, what about the behavior of permit holders? You know, because the concern is you let people carry permanent concealed handguns, they're going to have accidents, they're going to go and commit crimes themselves. And in fact, what you find is that permit holders tend to be extremely law-abiding. I don't know if you guys can read these things. But my book, the third edition of More Guns, Less Crime, that just came out this summer, goes through the data for 25 states and the text and footnotes. But I can just go through some of the stuff here. Let me mention Florida, for example. Between October 1st, 1987 and August 31st, 2010, Florida had issued permits to over 1.8 million people, about 1.84 million people. Many of those people had renewed them multiple times. On average, renewed them about 2.5 times. That means on average, the average permit holder had their permits for over 12 years. And of those people, 167 had had their permits revoked for any type of firearms-related violation. They don't go through it on the website, but I've called up the people who put together their statistics, and they tell me that overwhelmingly tends to be people who accidentally carried a concealed handgun into a gun-free zone, like a school or airport or something. But that's 1/100th of 1 percentage point. Now, another way you can look at it is over the last 32 months, since January 2008, there have been 4 additional permit holders who have had their permits revoked for any firearms-related violation. They have over 750,000 active permit holders in Florida. That comes to an annual revocation rate of 0.0002%. I would argue it's pretty hard to find virtually any other population that has as low of any type of, and again, most of these are fairly trivial violations that are there. Problem. An example of somebody who carried a concealed handgun into an airport, which you guys may know about, is Barry Switzer. Some years ago when he used to be coach for the Dallas Cowboys, for any football fans in here, trivia, he was late for a team game, ran into the airport, forgot he had a concealed handgun on him, buzzers went off, he gets arrested, couldn't make it to the team plane. But it's true the Cowboys were having a bad year, but I don't think anybody really viewed Barry Switzer as a real public safety threat that was there. He simply forgot that he had the handgun with him, and that's, when you're talking about millions of people with permits, that happens. Right now, my guess is, for the numbers, because I can't get it for all the states, and we can talk about that, because not all states require permits. But of the states that do require permits, and some states are counties, and I didn't call up all the 100 counties in some of these states to track down the numbers, but for the states where you are able to get numbers, it's basically about a little bit over 6.2 million Americans right now are legally licensed to carry permanent concealed handguns. It's a lot of people. And now if you look at Texas in 2009, there was a little bit over 400,000 people with active licenses. Now the last year the Department of Public Safety has detailed breakdowns for the behavior permit holders was 2007. They had about 290,000 active permit holders then. 160 were convicted for either misdemeanors or felonies. Overall, overwhelmingly these are misdemeanors. But overall it's a rate of about 0.05%, so it's about 0.05 of 1 percentage point. That's about 1/7 the rate of convictions for the general population. But again, the general population is more likely to commit felonies than these permit holders were. And the most frequent type of revocation, 29 of these 160 cases involve carrying a weapon without a license. Just like when you drive, you got to have your driver's license with you. Sometimes people forget to have their wallet or their license with them, and they get into trouble. But that's by far the biggest category. The next largest category was 24 cases of domestic violence. None of those involved a weapon being used of any type, let alone a gun. But over the preceding 5 years, from 2002 to 2006, the average rate that they were convicted of misdemeanors or felonies was 0.04%. So we could go through that more, but I think it gives you a pretty good idea of the breakdown. Now I know you guys are going to have some questions, so let me just kind of summarize here. And that is, my research convinces me that police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But I think one thing that police understand themselves is that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime has been committed. And that raises the question about what do you recommend that somebody do when they're having to defend themselves against a criminal. And simply telling people behave passively turns out to be pretty bad advice. Having a gun is consistently, according to the National Crime Victimization Survey by the Department of Justice, is consistently by far the safest course of action for people to take. You know, there's a statement that's often out there, and there's a kernel of truth to it, but I think it's very misleading. And that is, if you compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance together, passive behavior is slightly safer, though it's not really statistically significantly different. But the problem is, and the reason why it's misleading, is that under the heading of active resistance, you're lumping together all sorts of different things. Some which are much safer than passive behavior, and some which are much more dangerous. So for example, it includes everything from yelling, running away, using your fist, using a baseball bat, mace, a knife, a stun gun, or a gun. For example, for women, by far the most dangerous course for a woman to take when she's confronted by a criminal is to use her fist. There's a very simple reason for that, and that is you're virtually always talking about a male doing the attack. And for a woman to go and use her fist, there's very likely to be a physical response back from the attacker, and given that, a high probability of either serious injury or death. The second most dangerous course of action, again much, much more dangerous than passive behavior, is to run away. If women succeed in running away, that's great. But unfortunately, women tend to be significantly slower runners than men, particularly for the age groups which are most likely to engage in the violent crime. Anyway, if you break down these different categories, you find, rather than lumping everything together, you find that using guns is by far the safest course of action. And as I mentioned before, the other group, so there's basically two groups. There's women, the elderly, people who are relatively weaker physically benefit the most from owning guns, and also the people who are most likely to be victims of guns, which are basically, unfortunately, tend to be one very concentrated group in this country, and that's poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. So basically it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. So I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to try to answer.
In light of today's events, could you expand upon some more examples of some of the multi-crime victim events that were stopped by law-abiding citizens with their own
Oh,
firearms?
sure. Well, I mean, there are lots of them. A lot of them never even get much news attention because many times they get stopped before they get, anybody gets killed. But, you can go through, since I was supposed to give the talk originally in the law school today, I'll give one example from a law school. At the Appalachian Law School, about 8 years ago, there was an attack in which 3 people were killed. I actually gave a talk there a few years ago. They invited me to come there. It was pretty interesting to go and talk to the people who had been present at the attack. But what happened was 2 students there at the school who were outside when the attack started to occur. One of them a former deputy sheriff from North Carolina, a different state. Both of them had concealed carry permits in Virginia since they were living there at the time. Ran to their cars, got their handguns, came back, pointed their guns at the attacker. A third student tackled him, and the 3 of them held him on the ground for 11 and a half minutes before the police arrived. And again, I could go through the news media coverage on that. It's actually kind of interesting because if you do a Nexus search on that, in the 1 week after that attack, you'll find 218 separate news stories. Only 3 news stories actually mention that the students used their guns to stop the attack. Typically, you'd see discussions about students tackled the attacker, or subdued the attacker, or pounced on the attacker, or that they held him until the police arrived, all of which were true, though I would go and argue it's fairly misleading and actually dangerous because they somehow gave the impression that running across an open field in order to go and attack somebody who's armed is likely to be successful. And but anyway, I was on a radio show. Larry Elder, who's a friend of mine, used to have a national radio show based out of Los Angeles, and he had invited Tracy Bridges, one of the two students who had stopped the attack, on. And Tracy had mentioned that he had talked to at least 50 reporters the day of the attack. And also the other student had talked to a lot too. But being a law school student, having access to Nexus and Westlaw, he wanted to see what everybody wrote about him. So he'd gone and looked it up the next day, and he couldn't find himself in all the quotes and discussions about the fact. So I thought he was exaggerating a little bit. And so I decided to go and call up 50 reporters, who I didn't know which ones he had talked to. And I just wanted to know, did they know about the facts there? And all of them knew about it. And then I asked them, did they talk to either of the students? And all but 3 of them had talked to either one or both the students who had used their guns to stop the attack. And so I asked them then, well, why is it that you don't mention this in your story? You mentioned being pounced on or tackled or whatever. And Maria Lott at the Washington Post gave me the explanation, which to the extent I was able to get an explanation, she gave me, and she said she only had a little bit over 900 words to do the story. And she simply didn't have the space to get into it. She had 2 paragraphs on the type of gun that was being used. But my note to you all is, you think about the media bias, and before I tried to explain why most news coverage is not media bias, it's understandable why they're not newsworthy stories, okay? Because nothing bad happened. Here are stories which are already getting national and international news, and yet how it ended when a citizen used their gun to stop it isn't reported in those stories. And I think it has a big impact on people's perceptions about the costs and benefits for using guns in these types of situations.